The sound didn't belong in a bank. It was too sudden, too sharp, the kind that makes every conversation die mid-sentence. Emily Carter felt the world tilt for half a second before everything stilled, the polished marble floor beneath her cool and unforgiving, her hand instinctively pressing against her abdomen as a ripple of quiet shock spread across the lobby, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke. Because moments like this weren't supposed to happen under bright lights and security cameras and neatly arranged velvet ropes. Not in a place built on control and order and money. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just stop a room, it shifted the balance of power in ways no one saw coming. A phone lifted somewhere to the left, subtle but deliberate, someone whispering, "Is that being recorded?" As if saying it too loudly might make it real, might force them to pick a side, and near the center of it all stood Richard Hale, immaculate in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, adjusting his cuff like he just brushed past an inconvenience rather than a moment that had frozen an entire bank. "We're not doing this again," he said, his voice low but carrying, the kind of voice used to being obeyed, and he reached into his briefcase with calm precision, pulling out a single sheet of paper that looked harmless until you understood what it meant, sliding it across the counter toward her with a pen placed neatly on top like the final piece of a transaction. Emily didn't reach for it, her fingers trembling just slightly, not from fear but from something deeper, something quieter, the kind of realization that comes too late, or exactly on time depending on how you look at it. "Sign it," Richard continued, not raising his voice, because he didn't need to, because men like him rarely did, and around them the air thickened with tension, the soft hum of computers and distant printers suddenly too loud, too intrusive, as if the building itself was aware that something irreversible was unfolding. A teller behind the counter hesitated, glancing toward the glass-walled office at the far end of the room, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing was happening, because this was still a bank, still a place where appearances mattered, where chaos was something that belonged. Outside on the street, not inside among polished counters and quiet transactions, Emily swallowed, tasting something metallic at the back of her throat, her gaze dropping not to the paper but to her own wrist, where a thin silver bracelet caught the overhead light, subtle, almost forgettable unless you knew what it meant, unless you knew where it came from, and for the first time since she'd walked into that building. A faint shift passed through her expression, not defiance, not yet, but something close to it. "You don't know who I am anymore," she said softly, the words barely louder than a breath, and for a second Richard almost smiled, the kind of smile that came from certainty, from believing he had already won, that whatever she thought she knew didn't matter in a world where his name carried weight and hers had long since disappeared. And yet across the lobby, behind the glass doors of the private office, a man had just stepped out and stopped mid-stride, his eyes fixed. Not on Richard, not on the paper, but on that single glint of silver catching the light, his expression shifting in a way that didn't belong in a routine workday, in a way that suggested recognition, the kind that arrives quietly before it changes everything. Jonathan Whitmore did not rush, and that was the first thing people noticed, because in a moment where tension pulled tight like a wire, any sudden movement would have broken it, but he moved with measured precision, each step deliberate across the polished floor as if he had all the time in the world, even though every pair of eyes in the lobby had quietly shifted toward him. The assistant nearest the glass office straightened instinctively, recognizing authority without needing to hear it. Announced, while the security guard by the entrance subtly adjusted his stance, uncertain whether he was about to intervene or stand down. Jonathan's gaze never left Emily, not once, and as he drew closer the details sharpened, the pale tone of her face, the way her shoulders held tension beneath a simple coat, the protective placement of her hand, and most of all the bracelet. That unmistakable piece of silver that had not been seen in this building for years but had never been forgotten by those who understood its meaning. Richard noticed the shift in attention a fraction too late, his confidence holding steady as he followed the direction of the room's focus and found the older man approaching, his expression tightening slightly but only enough for someone trained to read people to notice, and he turned just enough to face him without stepping back, maintaining the illusion of control that had carried him through boardrooms and negotiations and every moment where dominance mattered more than truth. "Is there a problem?" Richard asked, his tone polite on the surface but edged with impatience underneath, the kind that assumed any interruption was temporary and ultimately irrelevant, and for a second Jonathan did not answer, his eyes moving once more to Emily's wrist, then to her face, searching for something deeper than recognition, something that could not be mistaken or dismissed. Emily met his gaze. And in that silent exchange something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need explanation but carried the weight of years, of distance, of choices made and consequences lived through, and her fingers tightened slightly over the bracelet as if acknowledging what it represented without drawing attention to it. The room held its breath, even the faint hum of machines seeming to fade as Jonathan finally spoke, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying an authority that did not need volume to be heard. "I think there is," he said, not looking at Richard but addressing the situation itself, as if the man standing in front of him was no longer the center of it, and that subtle shift landed harder than any raised voice could have. Richard let out a short breath that might have been a restrained laugh, glancing briefly at the nearby staff as if to remind them who he was, who held influence here, and he tapped the paper lightly with the pen, a gesture meant to pull focus back to the transaction he had orchestrated. "This is a private matter," he said, each word chosen to reassert control, to redraw the boundaries that were beginning to blur, but the effect did not land the way he expected, because no one moved, no one returned to their work, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Jonathan stepped closer, close enough now that the space between all three of them formed a quiet center in the middle of the room, and he lowered his gaze once more to the document on the counter without touching it, reading just enough to understand its purpose, his expression revealing nothing, and then he looked up again, this time directly at Richard, not with hostility but with something colder, something more final. "Nothing about this is private anymore," he said, and there was a subtle shift in the room as those words settled, as if an invisible line had just been crossed and everyone present understood it even if they could not yet explain why, and somewhere near the back a phone camera adjusted its angle, capturing the moment not because it was dramatic, but because it felt important in a way that would only make sense later. Richard's expression did not collapse all at once, it shifted in small, almost invisible fractures, the kind that only appear when certainty begins to lose its grip, and for the first time since he walked into that bank, he hesitated, not long enough for most people to notice, but long enough for the silence around him to grow heavier. "You are overstepping," he said finally, his voice firmer now, sharper, as if he could cut through whatever tension had formed simply by asserting himself harder. And he reached for the paper again, sliding it a few inches closer to Emily, doubling down on the moment he believed he still controlled. "This has nothing to do with you," he added, directing the words at Jonathan, but the statement landed weakly, because the room no longer agreed with him, because attention had already shifted away from his authority and towards something else, something quieter and far more grounded. Jonathan did not react to the tone, did not raise his voice or challenge him directly, and that lack of reaction unsettled Richard more than any confrontation could have, because it removed the fight he was prepared to win and replaced it with something he did not understand. "It has everything to do with me," Jonathan replied, his voice even, measured, but carrying a finality that felt like a door closing somewhere far above them, and then he turned slightly, just enough to address the nearest employee. "Pause all transactions on this floor," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of clarity that demanded compliance, and for a brief second the employee froze, caught between two versions of authority, before instinct chose for him and his hands moved to the keyboard, screens flickering as processes halted one by one. A murmur rippled through the lobby, subtle but unmistakable, as people began to understand that this was no longer a private dispute, that something larger had just taken hold of the situation, and Richard felt it, the shift, the ground beneath his assumptions beginning to tilt in ways he could not correct. "You cannot just shut down operations," he said, a trace of disbelief slipping through his control, but Jonathan did not look at him. Not yet, his attention returning instead to Emily, and in that moment the distance between who she appeared to be and who she actually was began to close. "Where did you get that bracelet?" Jonathan asked quietly, the question simple on the surface but carrying layers beneath it, layers that pressed against years of absence and unanswered questions, and Emily's breath caught for a fraction of a second before she answered, not loudly, not defensively, but with a steadiness that had not been there before. "It was never given away," she said, her voice calm despite everything. "I kept it." The words landed like a key turning in a lock, and Jonathan's expression shifted, not into shock, but into confirmation, as if something he had suspected was now undeniable, and he nodded once, slowly, before finally turning his full attention to Richard. The air tightened again, but this time it was different, not uncertain, not fragile, but decisive, and when Jonathan spoke next, his tone did not rise, but it carried a weight that filled the entire room. "Before you say another word," he said, "you should understand exactly who you are standing in front of." And Richard opened his mouth to respond, to reclaim the narrative, to reassert the version of reality that had always worked for him, but for the first time, no one was waiting to hear it, because something else was about to be revealed, something that would make everything he had built in that moment feel suddenly, irreversibly small. The room did not explode with noise, it tightened into something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that feels like pressure building behind glass, and Richard felt it before he understood it. The way control was slipping not through confrontation but through something far more precise. Jonathan did not rush the moment, he let it settle, let every eye in the room lean toward him without needing to call for attention, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of a decision already made. "Her name is not just Emily Carter," he said, each word deliberate, placed carefully into the silence. "Her name is Emily Whitmore." And for a fraction of a second nothing happened, as if the name needed time to land, to connect, to be recognized by those who understood what it meant, and then the shift came, subtle but undeniable, a change in posture from the staff, a flicker of realization in the eyes of those who had been watching, because Whitmore was not just a name in this building, it was a foundation, a history, a presence that existed long before any individual transaction or client. Richard's expression tightened, confusion flashing first, then dismissal. Because the alternative required accepting something he was not prepared to accept. "That is not possible," he said quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed could replace certainty, and he gave a short, controlled shake of his head. "You are mistaken." But Jonathan did not react to the denial, did not argue or defend the statement, because he did not need to, because truth in that moment did not rely on agreement. Emily remained still, her hand resting lightly over her abdomen, her other hand lowering slowly from the counter, as if releasing the last piece of hesitation she had been holding onto, and her gaze did not drop, did not waver, it stayed steady, meeting Richard's disbelief with something quieter, something more grounded, something that did not need to prove itself. "You said it yourself," she murmured, her voice calm but carrying clearly in the stillness. "You do not know who I am anymore." And the words did not sound like a challenge, they sounded like a statement of fact, one that had been waiting to be acknowledged. Jonathan took one step closer, positioning himself not between them but beside Emily, a subtle alignment that redefined the space, and he gestured slightly toward the nearest workstation. "Pull the ownership registry," he said, again without raising his voice, and this time there was no hesitation. Fingers moved quickly across keys, screens shifted, data appearing in quiet confirmation of something that until seconds ago had been invisible to almost everyone in the room. Richard's confidence cracked. Then, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that showed in the tension of his jaw, in the way his hand paused mid-motion over the paper, no longer certain whether the document in front of him still held any power at all, and he glanced briefly at the screen as if he could dismiss what was about to appear before it fully formed, but it was already too late, because once a truth begins to surface, it does not wait for permission to be seen. Jonathan's voice came again, softer now, but somehow more final. "She is the primary beneficiary of Whitmore Holdings," he said, and the words did not echo, they settled, deep and irreversible, and around them the room shifted again, not with shock this time, but with understanding, because everything that had seemed out of place a moment ago now aligned into something clear, something undeniable. Emily exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in triumph, but in quiet acceptance, as if she had known this moment would come and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. And when she looked at Richard again, there was no anger in her expression, no demand for apology, only a calm distance that spoke louder than any confrontation, because in that silence, the imbalance that had defined everything between them was already gone. Richard did not speak immediately, and that hesitation carried more weight than anything he could have said, because for the first time the numbers, the contracts, the quiet leverage he relied on no longer aligned in his favor, and he knew it even before the confirmation finished loading on the screen. The employee at the terminal swallowed and turned the monitor slightly, not dramatically, not to expose him, but enough for Jonathan to see clearly, and Jonathan did not need long, just a glance. Just a second, before he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that closed the question permanently. "That is not correct," Richard said finally, but the words lacked the force they once had. They sounded thinner now, stretched across doubt, and he straightened his posture as if that alone could restore balance. "There must be an error in your system," he added, reaching for the familiar defense of technical failure, but no one moved to support it, no one rushed to verify or correct. Because the authority in the room had already shifted and everyone felt it. Jonathan rested his hand lightly on the counter, not in control of it, but in quiet possession of the moment, and his gaze remained steady, not confrontational, not emotional, just certain. "There is no error," he said, and then, after a brief pause that let the words settle, "and there is no misunderstanding." And with that, the last thread of Richard's certainty began to unravel. Emily watched him, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, but with a calm that came from finally standing on ground that could not be taken from her, and for a brief second her eyes softened, not toward him, but toward the space between them, toward everything that had led to this point, every dismissal, every assumption, every moment he had believed she had nowhere else to stand. "You always said everything had a price," she said quietly, her voice even, her tone almost reflective. "You just never realized some things are not for sale." And the words did not rise, did not push, they simply existed, undeniable in their clarity. A faint movement near the entrance signaled another shift as two additional staff members approached, not hurried, not alarmed, but attentive, responding not to chaos but to instruction, to a structure that had reasserted itself around a different center of authority. And Jonathan turned slightly toward them, his voice remaining low but precise. "Flag all active accounts under Richard Hale for immediate review," he said. Each word measured, each instruction carrying consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the bank. Richard's hand tightened around the pen he still held, the small object now meaningless in the face of what was unfolding, and for the first time he looked directly at Emily without the filter of control or expectation, as if trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the reality standing in front of him. But there was nothing left to reconcile, because the version he understood no longer existed. "Emily," he said, her name unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, as if saying it might restore something, might bridge the distance that had opened between them, but she did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him, steady, composed, and then, after a moment, she shifted her gaze away, not in avoidance, but in closure, as if the need for his acknowledgement had already passed. Jonathan's voice came one final time in that moment, quieter than before but carrying a finality that no one questioned. "This conversation is over," he said, and unlike earlier, no one waited to see if it would continue, because everyone in the room understood that something irreversible had just taken place, something that did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures, only the quiet certainty of truth being seen at last. The shift did not end with Jonathan's final words, it expanded, quietly but decisively, like a ripple moving outward through still water, and the bank itself seemed to respond, screens updating, systems locking into new protocols, the subtle mechanics of power rearranging in real time. Richard stood where he was, but the space around him no longer belonged to him, not in the way it had just minutes ago. And that realization settled in slowly, pressing against his composure, testing the edges of the confidence he had carried for years. One of the staff members approached the counter with a tablet in hand, not hurried, not hesitant, simply following instruction, and stopped just short of Richard, her posture professional but firm. "Sir, I am going to need you to step aside while we complete a review," she said, her tone respectful but unmistakably directive, and the phrasing mattered because it was no longer a request. Richard let out a controlled breath, the kind meant to steady himself, to regain footing, but the usual responses did not come. The usual authority he could lean on was no longer recognized in this moment, and he glanced once toward Jonathan as if searching for an opening, for some negotiation, some reversal, but there was none offered, only quiet certainty. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her movements careful but steady. And for the first time since she had entered the building, she was not reacting, not enduring, she was simply present, grounded in a reality that no longer required her to prove anything, and the room seemed to adjust to that presence, to her stillness, to the calm that had replaced everything else. "You could have told me," Richard said after a moment, his voice lower now, not commanding, not even defensive, but searching, as if the answer might still change something, might soften what had already taken place. But Emily did not respond immediately, she let the silence hold for a second longer before speaking, her voice quiet but clear. "You never asked?" she said, and there was no accusation in it, only truth, simple and unadorned. Across the lobby, the faint sound of a phone notification broke through as someone captured the moment, not because it was chaotic, but because it felt final, the kind of moment people recognize even before they understand it, and a second employee moved toward the terminal again, confirming the flagged accounts, the internal alerts. Now active across departments, a process that would not reverse with a conversation or a signature. Jonathan turned slightly toward Emily, his expression softening just enough to reveal something beneath the authority, something personal, something that existed long before this moment, and he nodded once, a small gesture that carried reassurance without needing words, and Emily acknowledged it with a slight incline of her head. The exchange quiet but complete. Richard looked down at the paper. Still resting on the counter, the document that had seemed so certain, so final just minutes ago, and he reached out, not to enforce it, but to take it back, to remove it from the center of a situation it no longer controlled, folding it once, then again, the movement slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging its loss of meaning. "This is not over," he said, but the words lacked direction now, lacking the weight they once carried, and no one responded, because everyone understood that whatever came next would not happen here, would not unfold under his terms. Emily exhaled softly, not in relief, not in victory, but in quiet release, and she turned slightly away from the counter, her hand resting once more over her abdomen, grounding herself in something that mattered beyond contracts and accounts and power shifts, and without another word, she took a step forward, not leaving in haste, not escaping, but simply moving on, while behind her the systems continued their quiet work, sealing decisions that had already been made the moment truth stepped into the light. The glass doors at the front of the bank opened with a soft mechanical hum, and for a brief moment the outside world filtered in, the distant sound of traffic, the rhythm of normal life continuing as if nothing inside had shifted, but inside, everything had. Emily did not rush toward the exit, her steps measured, steady, each one grounded in a quiet certainty that had replaced the uncertainty she had carried in with her, and the distance between her and the counter grew not just physically but symbolically, a separation from everything that had once defined her position in that room. Behind her, the low murmur of voices began to return, cautious at first, as if people were unsure whether it was safe to speak again, whether the moment had truly passed or was still unfolding, and a teller leaned toward another, whispering something that could not quite be heard but carried the unmistakable tone of realization, of a story already beginning to take shape. Richard remained where he stood for a second longer than necessary, as if movement itself required permission he no longer possessed, and when he finally stepped back from the counter, it was not with authority but with calculation, his mind already searching for angles, for ways to regain ground outside of this space, because men like him did not accept loss easily, even when it was undeniable. "Emily," he called after her, not loudly, but enough to reach her before she crossed the midpoint of the lobby, and she paused, not turning immediately, not giving him the instant response he had once expected, and when she did turn, it was slow, composed, her expression unchanged, her posture calm. For a moment he seemed unsure what to say, the words that had once come so easily now caught somewhere between pride and realization. And when he finally spoke, it was not a demand, not a command, but something closer to an attempt at understanding. "Why did you stay silent?" he asked, the question carrying more weight than it appeared, because it revealed what he had truly believed all along, that silence meant absence, that what he did not see did not exist. Emily held his gaze for a second, just long enough for the answer to settle before she gave it. "Because I wanted to know who you were without it," she said, her voice even, her tone calm, and the words landed with a clarity that did not need explanation, because in that moment the difference between what he had shown and what he had been became impossible to ignore. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in defeat, not entirely, but in the beginning of recognition, the kind that arrives too late to change the outcome but early enough to understand it. Jonathan remained near the counter, watching not as a manager but as something more, his presence steady, his attention on Emily as she turned once more toward the exit, and he took a step forward, closing some of the distance without interrupting her path, his voice quieter now, carrying only to her. "You should not have had to handle this alone," he said, and Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, not dismissing him, but acknowledging something deeper. "I needed to see it for myself," she replied, and there was no regret in her voice, only acceptance. The doors opened again as she approached, the light from outside spilling across the floor in a soft contrast to the controlled brightness inside, and as she stepped through, the shift completed itself, not with noise or spectacle, but with quiet finality, leaving behind a room that would return to its routine, but never quite forget the moment when power had changed hands without a single raised voice. The air outside felt different, not because the city had changed, but because Emily had, and for a moment she stood just beyond the glass doors, the noise of passing cars and distant conversations blending into a steady rhythm that grounded her in something real, something unaffected by contracts or power or the quiet calculations that had defined the last hour. She did not look back immediately, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left behind that required her attention, and that realization settled deeper than anything else, a calm that did not need validation. Inside, through the reflection of the glass, movement resumed, but not as it had before, because the staff now moved with a different awareness, their conversations lower, more measured, as if the space itself had been recalibrated, and at the center of it, Richard remained near the counter, no longer commanding the room but occupying it. A subtle difference that carried more weight than any visible change. He glanced toward the doors, catching a partial reflection of Emily's silhouette, and for a brief second something crossed his expression that had not been there before, not anger, not frustration, but something closer to recognition, the kind that arrives when the narrative you believed in no longer holds, and there is nothing left to replace it. One of the staff members approached him again, tablet still in hand, her tone steady, professional. "Sir, we will need to follow up regarding your accounts," she said, and the phrasing was deliberate, not confrontational, but firm enough to leave no room for negotiation, and Richard nodded once, a small, controlled movement that acknowledged the shift without fully accepting it, because acceptance would come later, in quieter moments, away from witnesses. Jonathan stepped back from the counter, his role in the immediate moment complete, but his presence still anchoring the room, and he exchanged a brief glance with the employee at the terminal, a silent confirmation that the necessary steps were already in motion, processes that extended beyond this branch, beyond this hour, into systems designed to respond without emotion, without hesitation. Outside, Emily finally exhaled fully, the breath slow and steady, her hand resting lightly over her abdomen as she adjusted to the space around her, to the open sky above, to the simple fact that she was no longer inside that room, and the weight she had carried there did not follow her out. A car passed by, the sunlight catching briefly on its surface, and she took a step forward, then another, not in a hurry, not escaping, but continuing, moving into a future that no longer depended on anyone else's recognition. Behind her, the doors opened again as Jonathan stepped outside, not calling her name immediately, not breaking the moment, but allowing her a few seconds more of silence before he spoke, his voice calm, familiar in a way that belonged to a time before everything had become complicated. "Emily," he said, and she turned this time without hesitation, meeting his gaze with the same steadiness she had carried through the entire encounter. He did not ask questions, did not demand explanations, because some things did not need to be unpacked in that moment, and instead he simply said, "You have a place to go." And it was not framed as an offer, not even as a suggestion, but as a fact, something that had always been true even when it had been set aside. Emily nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and for the first time since she had stepped into the bank, a faint shift touched her expression, not quite a smile, but something close, something that suggested not relief, but clarity, and as she turned forward again, the distance between who she had been and who she now understood herself to be finally aligned, not through confrontation, not through force, but through the quiet, undeniable weight of truth. Jonathan did not walk ahead of her, and he did not fall behind. He matched her pace, a quiet presence at her side as they moved along the sidewalk, the rhythm of their steps steady against the distant hum of the city, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because silence, in that moment, felt more honest than anything words could offer. The building behind them faded into reflection and glass. Just another structure in a line of structures, but what had happened inside it lingered in a different way, not as something unresolved, but as something completed. "I looked for you," Jonathan said after a while, his voice low, not demanding an answer, not accusing, just stating something that had lived quietly beneath years of distance. And Emily did not stop walking, but her gaze shifted slightly forward, as if aligning with a memory she had already made peace with. "I know," she replied, and there was no defensiveness in her tone, no explanation offered, only acknowledgement. Because some gaps between people are not filled with words, they are simply understood. A car slowed briefly at the curb, then moved on, the moment passing without interruption, and Jonathan nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was, not pushing further, because the need to understand every detail had long since given way to something simpler, something more important, the fact that she was here now. "You should not have had to give anything up," he said, not as a correction but as a quiet reflection, and Emily let out a soft breath, her hand resting once more over her abdomen as she adjusted her posture, grounding herself in the present. "I did not give it up," she said, her voice steady. "I stepped away." And the distinction mattered because it spoke not of loss, but of choice, of a decision made with intention, even if it had come with consequences. Jonathan glanced at her then, really looked at her, not as a figure tied to family or legacy, but as someone who had carried her own path through uncertainty and come out the other side with something intact, something unbroken, and he gave a small nod, the kind that signaled understanding without needing agreement. Behind them, inside the bank, Richard stood near the same counter, but the room no longer felt like his environment. It felt like a place he had entered without fully understanding the rules that governed it, and the staff around him moved with quiet efficiency, continuing processes that no longer involved him as a point of control, but as a subject within a system that had already shifted beyond his reach. He glanced once more toward the doors, but the reflection showed only movement now, no clear figure to focus on, and that absence settled differently than presence ever had, because it left nothing to negotiate with, nothing to influence. Outside, Emily slowed slightly as they reached the corner, the traffic light shifting from red to green, and for a brief moment she paused, not out of uncertainty, but to take in the simple act of choosing direction. Something that had been overshadowed by everything else until now, and then she stepped forward, crossing with measured confidence, each step quiet but certain. Jonathan followed, not guiding, not leading, simply present, and as they reached the other side, he spoke again, not about the past, not about what had just happened, but about what came next. "There are things we need to review," he said, his tone practical, grounded. "But there is no rush." And Emily nodded, because for the first time in a long time, there was not, and as they continued down the street. The space behind them did not pull them back, it simply remained where it was, a completed chapter that no longer needed to be revisited. The city did not pause for them, it never did, but something in the way Emily walked now made it feel like it had slowed just enough to let her breathe, and that subtle shift mattered more than anything that had happened inside the bank, because it was not about what she had revealed, it was about what she no longer carried. Jonathan glanced at his watch briefly, not out of urgency, but out of habit. The kind that comes from years of managing time, decisions, and consequences, and then he looked back at her, measuring not her pace, but her state, as if making sure she was not moving too fast for what her body could handle. "There is a car waiting a block ahead," he said, his tone practical, offering structure without pressure, and Emily nodded once, acknowledging the information without changing her rhythm, because for once she did not feel the need to rush toward the next step. The sidewalk stretched ahead, lined with storefronts and reflections of passing movement, and in those reflections, for brief moments, she caught glimpses of herself, not as she had been seen inside that bank, but as she was now, composed, steady, and no longer defined by someone else's assumptions. "They will start calling," Jonathan added after a second, not looking at her directly as he said it, but letting the statement exist as a simple truth. "Board members, advisors, people who have been waiting for confirmation." And Emily exhaled softly, not overwhelmed, not surprised, just aware, because she had known this part would come eventually, even if she had not known when. "Let them wait," she said quietly, her voice even, and there was no hesitation in it, no urgency to respond or explain, because the urgency belonged to them, not to her. Behind them, the bank had already begun to transition the situation into something formal, reports being generated, notifications sent, processes unfolding in a structured, methodical way that removed emotion from the equation, and Richard found himself on the receiving end of that structure. Answering questions that were no longer optional, providing information that was no longer controlled, and with each step, the distance between his perception of control and the reality of it became clearer. He stepped aside as directed, not resisting, not fully complying, but caught in that space where resistance no longer held power, and he glanced once more toward the entrance, as if expecting to see her return, to correct something, to soften what had already been set in motion, but the doorway remained unchanged, reflecting only the movement of strangers passing by, outside. Emily slowed as they reached the corner Jonathan had mentioned, and a black sedan came into view, parked with quiet precision, its presence understated but intentional, and the driver stepped out as they approached, opening the rear door without speaking, his actions practiced, respectful, not intrusive. Emily paused for a second before stepping forward, not because she was uncertain, but because she was aware of the transition. The shift from one space into another, from anonymity into recognition, and she turned her head slightly, looking down the street they had just walked, not searching for anything, just acknowledging it, and then she stepped into the car, her movements smooth, unhurried. Jonathan followed, taking the seat opposite her, and as the door closed with a soft, final sound, the outside noise dimmed, replaced by a controlled quiet that matched the calm she now carried, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Because nothing needed to be said immediately, the car pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic, and Emily rested her hand lightly over her abdomen again, her gaze forward, not fixed on anything specific, but aligned with something internal, something steady, something that no longer depended on proving anything to anyone, and as the city moved around them, the path ahead no longer felt uncertain, it simply felt open. The car moved smoothly through the city, each turn deliberate, each stop measured, and inside, the quiet allowed space for thoughts that had been held back, not avoided, but postponed until the moment felt right, and now that moment had arrived without urgency, without pressure. Emily watched the passing streets through the tinted window, familiar places blending into one another, but none of them pulling her attention the way they once might have. Because her focus was no longer anchored to where she had been, it had shifted forward, towards something that had been waiting for her to return. Jonathan sat across from her, not interrupting the silence, not filling it with explanations or expectations, because he understood that clarity did not come from being told what to do next, it came from recognizing it for yourself, and after a few minutes he finally spoke, his tone calm, grounded. "The board will convene within 24 hours," he said, each word steady, offering information without urgency. "They will want confirmation from you directly." And Emily nodded slightly, not surprised, not overwhelmed, simply acknowledging the next step as part of a process she was now ready to face. "They always needed that," she replied quietly, her voice even, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested this was not new information, just something she had chosen not to engage with before. The car slowed briefly at a traffic light, the red glow reflecting faintly across the interior, casting soft shadows that shifted with the movement outside, and for a moment everything felt suspended, not uncertain, just pause between what had been and what was about to begin. "You do not have to prove anything to them," Jonathan added after a second, not as reassurance, but as a statement of fact, because the truth had already been established, the structure already in place, and Emily let out a soft breath, not tense, not relieved, simply present. "I know," she said, and the certainty in her voice was quiet but complete. Behind them, in a different part of the city, Richard sat alone in a smaller, more confined space, a private office now turned into something else, something less controlled, as documents were reviewed, accounts flagged, conversations recorded in a tone that did not invite negotiation, and for the first time, he was not directing the outcome, he was part of it, and that shift settled heavily, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual understanding that there were systems he had underestimated, connections he had never considered, and consequences that did not respond to influence. He leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused for a moment, replaying the sequence of events, not searching for where it had gone wrong, but for where he had failed to see what was in front of him, and the answer, when it came, was simple, too simple, because it had never been hidden, it had only been ignored. The light turned green, and the car moved forward again, the city opening up into a broader avenue lined with taller buildings, reflections of glass and steel stretching upward, and Emily shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting her posture, her hand once again resting lightly over her abdomen, grounding her in something that extended beyond business, beyond legacy, something that carried its own meaning independent of everything else. "There will be questions," Jonathan said, his voice quieter now, more reflective than procedural. "About where you have been, about why you chose to step away." And Emily turned her gaze from the window to meet his, her expression calm, steady. "Then I will answer them," she said, not with defensiveness, not with hesitation, but with a clarity that did not need to prepare itself, because the answers were already there, already lived, and as the car continued forward, the path ahead did not feel like something she had to navigate carefully. It felt like something she had already chosen, long before this moment made it visible. The car slowed as it turned into a quieter street, the kind lined with buildings that did not need signs to announce their importance, where presence alone carried weight, and as it came to a smooth stop in front of a glass-fronted structure, Emily's gaze lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if she had always known this place would be part of her return. The driver stepped out first, opening the door with the same quiet precision as before, and for a brief second the outside air filled the space again, cooler now, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere beyond the city blocks, and Emily stepped out without hesitation, her posture steady, her movements measured, as if each step was aligned with something she had already decided. Jonathan joined her, his presence close but not leading, and together they approached the entrance, the glass doors reflecting them for a moment before sliding open, revealing a lobby that felt different from the one they had left. Not because it was more luxurious, but because it was quieter, more controlled, a place where decisions were made without spectacle. Inside, a receptionist looked up immediately, recognition flashing across her expression before it settled into professional composure, and she stood without needing to be asked. "Mr. Whitmore," she said respectfully, her tone steady, but her eyes shifted briefly to Emily, not questioning, not surprised, but aware, as if the information had already reached this space before they had. Jonathan nodded once, acknowledging her without breaking stride. "We will use the conference room," he said, and there was no need to specify which one, because the instruction carried its own clarity, and the receptionist stepped aside, signaling quietly to someone behind her, a chain of communication beginning without sound. Emily walked beside him, her gaze taking in the details, the clean lines, the muted tones, the absence of unnecessary movement, and there was no tension in her posture, no hesitation in her steps, because this environment did not feel foreign, it felt familiar in a way that did not rely on memory, but on understanding. As they reached the conference room, the door was already open, a long table inside, screens dark but ready, chairs arranged with precision, and Jonathan gestured slightly, not directing her, but offering the space. "You can take a moment if you need it," he said, his voice quiet, but Emily shook her head gently, stepping inside without pause, because the moment had already been taken. Back at the bank, back in the silence where everything had shifted, she moved to the far side of the table, not claiming a position, but standing where she could see the entire room, and for a brief second she rested her hand lightly on the surface, grounding herself, not in uncertainty, but in presence, in the reality of what was now in front of her. Jonathan remained near the doorway, watching her not as someone evaluating, but as someone witnessing, and after a second he stepped in fully, closing the door behind them with a soft, final click that separated this space from everything outside. "They will arrive soon," he said, his tone steady, not rushed, and Emily nodded once, her gaze lifting from the table to meet his, calm, composed, and ready, because whatever questions were coming, whatever conversations would follow, they were no longer about proving who she was, they were about what she would choose to do with it, and that difference changed everything. The room did not fill all at once, it gathered, one person at a time, quiet footsteps in the hallway, the soft opening of the door, the subtle shift of presence as individuals entered and took their seats without unnecessary conversation, because rooms like this did not require noise to carry importance. Emily remained where she stood at the far side of the table, her posture steady, her gaze calm, not avoiding, not challenging, simply present, and as each member of the board settled in, their attention moved toward her naturally, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when something long anticipated finally arrives. Jonathan took his place near the head of the table, not leading the moment, but anchoring it, and for a brief second the room held still, a collective pause before the first words were spoken, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding that what came next would define more than just a decision. "Emily," one of the board members began, his tone measured, respectful, but before he could continue, she lifted her hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to guide the moment, and the gesture alone was enough to shift the room into silence again. "You already know who I am," she said, her voice calm, clear, not raised, but carrying through the space with quiet certainty, and there was no need for introduction, no need for validation, because everything that mattered had already been established before she entered that room. She let the words settle for a second, not rushing forward, allowing the weight of them to be fully recognized, and then she continued. "The only question now is what comes next," and the simplicity of the statement removed everything unnecessary, leaving only what mattered. A few glances were exchanged across the table, not in disagreement, not in doubt, but in acknowledgement, because the structure they represented had always been waiting for this moment, even if they had not known when it would arrive. Jonathan watched her closely, not evaluating, not intervening, simply observing. And there was something in his expression that had shifted, not authority, but respect, because what she carried into that room was not inherited, it was chosen. Emily rested her hand lightly against the table, grounding herself, her other hand naturally returning to the gentle curve of her abdomen, a quiet reminder of something beyond the room, beyond the decisions about to be made, and for a brief second her gaze softened, not losing focus, but expanding it, aligning two futures into one. "I am not here to reclaim something I lost," she said, her tone steady, deliberate. "I am here to decide what I build with it." And the words did not sound like a declaration, they sounded like a direction, clear, unforced, and final in their own way. No one spoke immediately after, not because they did not have questions, but because the answer they needed had already been given, not in detail, not in strategy, but in intent, and intent, in a room like this, carried more weight than anything else. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the quiet decisions shaping what would come next, and far from this room, Richard sat in a space that felt smaller than before, not because it had changed, but because his understanding of it had, and in that contrast, the distance between them became complete, not measured in miles or money, but in clarity. Back in the conference room, Emily met the gaze of each person at the table, not seeking approval, not demanding agreement, simply allowing them to see her as she was now, fully present, fully certain, and as the silence finally shifted into motion, into conversation, into the beginning of something new, it did so without resistance, because the outcome had already been decided the moment she chose to stand where she was, and in that quiet, undeniable shift, one truth remained. Steady and unspoken, that some men only understand the value of power when they realize it was never theirs to begin with.